Welcome to Parenting Teens, Stoicism for Resilience and Wellbeing. We're so pleased you're with us today. This is going to be a great conversation. I have here with me Paul Wilson, Eve Riches, and Meredith Alexander Kunz, and I will be posing questions to them as the facilitator. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to our wonderful panelists today at Stoicare. So first of all, Meredith Alexander Kunz is a writer, editor, and communications leader who has worked in journalism, higher education, and the technology industry. Her writing has appeared in newspapers and magazines, including Newsweek, the San Francisco Daily Journal, the Stanford Report, and the Industry Standard. In 2016, she created the Stoic Mom blog, which you can find at www.thestoicmom.com. And she's also now on Substack under the same name. And I highly recommend this blog, especially for those of us with teens, preteens, and teenagers. So she explores the many ways that caregivers and kids can benefit from practicing Stoicism. And she's also a contributing editor for the Stoic magazine. And she shared her writing, talks, and interviews on Stoicism Today, NPR affiliate radio, and of course, conferences. So Meredith, thank you for being here. Would you like to share a little bit about yourself and your experiences as a parent?
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so glad to talk about these topics today. I am a mom of two daughters who are 17 and 15 at this point. My older daughter just graduated from high school, so I definitely have been experiencing the full range of teens in my home for a while. And really, my daughters and my experience as a parent is what inspired me to get into Stoicism in the first place. Because raising young kids, I really felt a sense of loss of control and questioning and a lot of anxieties and just wondering, was I doing the right thing, and is this the right choice? And I needed new guideposts, so I started reading ancient Stoic philosophy and its modern interpreters, and that has really helped me immensely, and that's why I decided to share it in my blog and my Substack. So I use a lot of those techniques and a lot of things inspired by ancient philosophy with my kids and my family. And I'm happy to talk about that today.
Wonderful. I can totally relate to your story because I too found Stoicism partly because I was looking for ways to raise my kids in a good ethical way. And I often say my kids made me a Stoic, so I
Very
can
true.
definitely relate. Okay, we also have Eve Riches, who is a mentor and teacher working across disability employment support, Stoicism, and psychology teaching, as well as mentoring looked after children and promoting disability equality. She's particularly focused on improving emotional resilience and applying Stoicism to everyday life. She supports families of neurodivergent teenagers, including teens and their parents, so whole family approach. Eve is also a steering committee member with Modern Stoicism, an advisor to the Aurelius Foundation, and of course, co-founder and vice president of Stoicare. So Eve, glad you're with us today. Would you like to say a few words about your experience?
Being vice president sounds very fancy, doesn't it? Um, yeah, yeah, I suppose I've picked up Stoicism throughout my life, even from when I was a teenager myself. I started reading about philosophy. But I think, like the two of you, I think there's nothing like becoming a parent that really makes you think about if you're not born into, I wasn't raised with a religious faith, and I think that's becoming increasingly common that people don't have a kind of structure or a belief system within which to raise their children. I kind of didn't have anything. So like you two were saying, it became even more important when I became a parent. I have raised a teenager. She's raised now, so she's 29. I was just saying I should lie about how old she is, because it's saying something about my own age. But yeah, a true Stoic wouldn't say that there's anything bad about that. Um, but I feel like that parenting of a teenager, it definitely goes on into the 20s. And as a psychologist, I don't want to shock you by the news that the brain is very much still actively developing. I was reading some research the other day that was saying your prefrontal cortex, so like your self-control and all of that, is still developing up to potentially 32. So those of you who are like, oh yeah, I've done the whole teen thing, this is fine now, I've got fully grown adults. Yeah, maybe not completely. So, but I think all of the things that we're going to talk about today will be equally true of parenting adult children. And so, yeah, I think it will still be useful when your teens are a little bit more grown. Thank you,
Absolutely. Yes.
Brittany.
Yes. Thank you. You're bringing a different perspective, Eve. So looking forward to that. Meanwhile, Paul Wilson is a former head of community mental health services and a strategic lead for the prevention of mental health issues and the promotion of well-being in disadvantaged communities. One of his mental health services won a national award, while others were recognized in the UK Parliament. Paul now works as the head of staff well-being at Cardiff University, where he promotes preventative practice, psychological safety, self-care, and a culture of well-being. Stoicism is his preferred form of self-care. So, Paul, glad to have you here as the father of the group among us. Would you like to say a few words about your experience?
Certainly, Brittany, and thank you for the introduction. It makes me sound far more impressive than I actually am. I'm really interested in this subject and interested from learning from the exchanges that we'll inevitably have today. Working in a university, I'm very conscious of the power of transition points in our lives. So I'm very conscious that people arrive in a university, young people arrive in a university in a very vulnerable state, really. They've just shed the protective shell of childhood, and they're trying to adjust to what the adult world demands of them, which is a lot these days. So we give a lot of thought to how, in the university, how we protect young people at transition points, primarily when they join us and when they leave us. But yes, there's no getting around the fact that I think teenagers are very vulnerable in this day and age, and they've always been vulnerable, of course, because they're learning to relate to the adult world for the first time. They're creating identities of their own, separate and distinct from the identity they enjoyed during childhood. It's a very tough phase. I've been thinking about a lot and thinking about adequate ways of describing it. I'm not sure that I can come up with any, but I am, yeah. I think it's very important that we recognize that vulnerability during this key kind of transitional phase into the latter stages of life. So hopefully we'll focus a little bit of time and attention on that today.
Right. And you have 3 of your own children, right?
I do. Our eldest is 21. I have a daughter of 18, who I spent the day in London with yesterday. It was really nice. And then our youngest child is 11. And you can probably guess which one of the 3 is the accident. A wonderful, joyful accident, I should add.
The best kind.
Absolutely.
Right. So thank you for joining us, Paul. Yeah, so these 3 are experts. Many have already raised teens, and I will be looking to them. I have 3 children of my own, but they're younger, ages 6, 9, and 10. So I'm kind of looking forward at the horizon of, okay, how do I prepare my children to be teenagers? How do we weather the storms of adolescence and prepare for adulthood? So I'm asking questions today as turning to these experts as people who have already done this. So thank you to our audience as well for being here. We will get started with our first question, which is going to be for Paul, working in the field of well-being and resilience. So let's just start off by defining kind of generally, what do we mean when we say well-being and resilience? What are we really talking about here? So Paul, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can try and answer those questions. Obviously, they're very personal responses, and conscious that both terms are often quite poorly defined. Not very exactly defined, and people's opinions on them vary. I have reflected upon what resilience means to me, personally and professionally, and I think the term I would use is one of a certain kind of elasticity or suppleness of spirit, something that gives us the ability to bounce back when buffeted by life's often very painful experiences. I don't want to use an overly simplistic image, but I'm going to do it anyway, so I don't know why I said that. The obvious one that springs to mind is that of a tree. A brittle tree will break in the face of a strong wind. A tree with shallow roots will be uprooted in the face of a strong wind. The term resilience has relevance to that image, I think. a supple tree bends in the face of such things. And human beings have a similar capacity. When I refer to deep roots, that's one area where, of course, young people are particularly vulnerable, because when I think of deep roots in the context of the human experience, I suppose I'm referring to life experience, to knowledge, to wisdom, and so forth. And young people haven't had the time to acquire those things. So not only are they in a vulnerable state, they are experiencing many of life's challenges for the first time. They have no precedent. They've got nothing to refer to. They don't know that they'll be able. Everything is extremely painful because they've never experienced it before. And I suppose what I'm thinking of here is the first time my eldest boy had his heart broken. Supporting him through that was it was a difficult experience. He couldn't believe that the reassuring things I was saying to him, such as, I know it's impossible for you to believe this right now, but the pain will pass in the not too distant future, sooner than you realize. This will be a bittersweet moment instead of just a bitter one. You'll look back upon it with gratitude, because it was a lovely experience while it lasted, and even more difficult to believe you will meet someone else and you will love them just as much, if not more. Of course, he didn't believe any of that at the time. That was getting on for about 2 years ago now. But lo and behold, exactly those things unfolded over the passage of time, and now he can see the truth of them. More importantly, he's got that experience now, and he can take that into later life. So yes, there's the vulnerability, there's the lack of precedent in their lives, things that they can make previous experiences, they can make comforting comparisons with. All of those make those first formative experiences as they transition from childhood into later life more difficult and more painful, but bearable. And they are experiences that they can, generally speaking, recover from. So I'm not sure how good a definition of resilience that was, but
no, I love that. That's perfect. That follows on from Seneca, who first introduced the tree quote to the world. So going back to the ancient roots of Stoicism, right?
I have read Seneca's letters. That particular image didn't come from Seneca, but it's a very good one. So I'm happy to be associated. Thank you.
It is, yeah. And I love the example too. That's something, we can all relate to, is those relationships. And you just have to experience it for yourself. Nobody can give that to you. Nobody can, prepare you for it. You just have to experience it. So I think that's a great example. So Meredith,
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Paul.
Did you want me to try and define well-being as well?
Sure. How does well-being relate to resilience?
And I should certainly be able to answer this question, because I'm paid to be able to answer this question. So I'm keeping pressure on myself here. It is, as with resilience, there are numerous different ways in which you can define the concept. What we are finding is that it is an increasingly popular and high-profile concept. So 10 years ago, for example, when I worked in community mental health services, we'd only ever talk about mental health. These days, the term well-being is often coupled to mental health. So when we talk about mental health, it's mental health and well-being. So there's a growing prominence of this broader concept, and well-being is a broader concept. It's an attempt to define, I suppose, the multidimensional nature of human beings in a way that encompasses our mental health, our physical health, but dimensions beyond those obvious dimensions too. And there is no limit to what you can add in this space, I suppose, but quite frequent references are made to spiritual well-being. I had a long conversation with our university chaplains on the subject last week. They're very enthusiastic about it. Financial well-being, social well-being, recognizing the importance of our social connections, the necessity of having positive relationships, that being a good predictor of good mental health throughout our lives. So a multi-dimensional state that we have to recognize and tend to. So we recognize that all those dimensions represent different needs that we will have that need to be met to a level that is satisfactory to us as the unique individuals that we are. Beyond that, then I would say the state of well-being is one that keeps us somewhere between functioning and flourishing in life. And that's a concept that has Stoic resonance, is of course flourishing.
Right. We've talked about before how maybe well-being is the new eudaimonia.
Yes.
So this is an ancient classical concept, eudaimonia, which is more about the whole person and the whole life as in terms of flourishing, and not just the deficit model that mental health these days tends to look at, right? So more along the lines of positive psychology, as we've discussed in previous workshops. And this is overall a very positive development, right? You would say?
Almost certainly. And I think that's a very, very good description of the connection between the ancient and the modern in this field. One thing we are increasingly trying to do is to couple modern psychological research, particularly that emanating from the field of positive psychology, with ancient wisdom, specifically Stoic wisdom, to have two, I suppose, different sources of evidence to validate these internally important things. So yes, most definitely a modern version of that, Brittany. So yeah, a good level of well-being in theory keeps us somewhere between functioning and flourishing in our personal and professional lives, and that's important to all of us, and keeps us out of a state of dysfunction, which is also very important to each of us. How do we do that? Through, creating a program of self-care practices that boost our well-being on a daily basis. So it sounds simple, but of course it isn't. It's enormously complex, especially in a very often hostile social environment, which teenagers in particular are conscious of and susceptible to. Was that an adequate definition?
More than adequate. It was excellent.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Paul. And we will, throughout this talk, we will talk about both teenagers, but also parents a little bit later. How does well-being and resilience apply to us as parents as well as to our teens? Okay, so moving to Meredith now, would you like to share maybe some examples from raising your children about how this applies specifically to teenagers?
Yes, I would. Thank you. I just want to start with saying it's totally normal and typical for teens to experience a lot of emotional ups and downs. And when we talk about resilience, I think it's really about being able to process those emotions and bounce back over time. And it's about being able to start noticing the things that trigger the negative emotions or the overwhelming feelings and that could potentially hold us back, or and find ways to cope with those things, because it's inevitable that those things will difficult things will happen. And learning to become comfortable with coping when things are hard, I think, is really critical for our teens. Because one thing I love in Stoicism is it really teaches us that things will not always go well. Things will not always be perfect. Things will not always be peaches and cream. We will have challenges, and that should be accepted and normalized. And I think that there are some issues here because teens are getting a lot of messages also about wellness, which I think is a different thread, different from well-being, but they're getting these messages, especially via social media and things they read and see online. And in fact, I've heard that a lot of teens feel that they're failing in wellness, and that they can't be perfectly well or achieve perfect well-being all the time. Therefore, they've failed. And so that's yet another thing that they feel judgment heaped upon themselves, and pressure about. So I think one thing I try to talk about with my teens is, there are going to be challenges, and it's about how do we kind of cope with those, and how do we cope with the really big and difficult emotions, and then be able to find ways to bounce back. And to really keep changing our own mindset, because we cannot control all these things that are happening around us. And of course, in Stoicism, this dichotomy of control around things that are in our power and other things that are not, which is really the majority of things, is a very, very important message. Learning about what is not in our control and the power of choice that we have around our own thoughts. One thing I've said before in my blog and in some talks is I sort of made up this little phrase: stop, drop, and question our impressions. Because I really think that, we're kids and adults are constantly, inundated with all these kinds of messages from our peers, from our society, from media, from everywhere. And we have to question it all. And this is what I love in Stoicism too. It's that we can stop and analyze our own thoughts about things around us and our feelings. And the thoughts and feelings are not objective facts. You know, they can be analyzed and they can be processed and they can be understood better. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, I know that's a major theme, which is really powerful as well. And I think this can help teens help them work with peer pressure, social pressure, you know, parental pressure, any pressure that they feel. Because it's about being able to make these choices and choose our own values and focus on our own character and the virtues, and in Stoicism, the major virtues of wisdom, justice, courage, and self-control. We can aim for these things in our character. I know it gets kind of abstract for teens. So one thing that I've tried to do is find, you know, some metaphors that teens could relate to. And I think the favorite one for my daughters is the Stoic archer. This is the metaphor where it's about the archer is aiming with, you know, takes the bow and arrow and aims for a target over there and starts to try to shoot the arrow, aiming really well as best as he can. But aiming is in our control, but whether or not you hit the target is not in your control. And so a gust of wind can come out of nowhere and blow the arrow completely off course, or someone may come and catch the arrow, or someone else may come and shoot your arrow off to the side. And so you might not be able to really achieve what you set out for or accomplish what you wanted to do, but you have done your best and you have tried to get to that point. And so I asked I was asking my older daughter, like, what is the most important thing that you've learned from Stoicism and from what I've shared with you? And she said it's this Stoic archer metaphor, because there's so many things that she's tried to accomplish and wanted to do. And sometimes she sees it doesn't turn out how she hoped. And it's, you know, a lot more difficult to hit that target, and that it's not her fault. I mean, I think a lot of what kids go through is a lot of, you know, self-blame and, you know, negative feelings about, oh, I'm, you know, and they see a lot of perfect looking images in media and social media in particular. And they think, oh, why can't I be like that? Why can't I look like that? Why can't I have that vacation? Why can't I, you know, there's just so much that they're exposed to. So I'm going to say the Stoic archer is really, really a key one that I'd like to share. And just one more comment I was going to make is that when I say teens are blaming themselves, but I think they also feel blamed by everyone else. I think they need resilience at a really high level, because even the expectations that the culture we live in is often that, you know, teens are tech obsessed, teens are self-absorbed, teens are not, you know, able to kind of get it together. And even I was walking in a park last weekend, and my father-in-law was there, and an older gentleman came up to him and said, oh, these kids today, they can't even read a trail map. Here, we're looking at this trail map, and those teens over there, they don't even know where they're going. And my daughters heard this, they got really offended. And they're thinking, you know, yet another minor case, but like of people just saying teens can't do anything or are just obsessed with their phones. So I think, you know, Gen Z, which is the generation of my teens, feel pretty burdened by what people think about their generation. And they also feel burdened by a lot of things going on in the world, including issues around the environment, issues around social justice, and a lot of things that kind of weigh on them super heavily. So I feel that this topic of resilience is super critical for them to find these ways to bounce back. And as parents, we can really help them too. I did want to share a quote that there's a psychologist and writer I follow named Lisa Damour, who's really interesting and just published some new books about teens. And she said something along these lines, that we need to also learn to tolerate our kids' distress so that we can show the capacity for kids to tolerate their own distress. And we can really try to serve as a steady presence, even if we don't feel that way all the time, because we often will feel a lot of emotions in reaction to our teens' emotions. But our goal is to try to still be a steady presence, or sometimes people say a non-anxious presence for our kids.
Right. Thank you, Meredith. And I know that phrase is also from a book that you and I both enjoy, The Self-Driven Child, which I would highly recommend to everybody. I think you would as well.
Definitely.
So having us as role models obviously can really be reassuring to our children.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. And we will come back in a little while to kind of those social pressures that Meredith was talking about. But first, I'd like to go to Eve. So Eve, your perspective as having worked with teenagers for a long period of your career, what do you see as the connection between kind of mental health and resilience?
I mean, it was really brilliant to hear everything that Paul and Meredith have shared, and I just fully agree with everything that they've said there. And I was thinking about it, it really bugs me because I've worked with teens for, I mean, I keep saying it's 25 years, and then I just realized it's 27 years. So, okay. But when I tell people that I work with teenagers, people go, oh my God, really? You know, like as if it's this terrible job. And why would you want to be around teenagers? Which is so horrific because that can't be helping. You know, like you were saying, Meredith, I think they get a very bad press. And I was thinking about what Paul said about this being a vulnerable time, and I think it is because it's a transition. And it's a hormonal transition as well, like menopause, like being pregnant. You know, these times where we're going through this transition. So they are vulnerable, but I don't think they are weak, but I think that they're being told that they're weak. And I was thinking about the last class that I ever taught when I was told that 5 students had to sit in the chair nearest the door in case they got overly distressed and needed to run out. And I remember saying at the time, you know, what am I going to do? Stack them up like pancakes? They can't all sit in the chair nearest the door, you know? And it's like, it's this thing where they've been told you've got this disease called anxiety, and you know you've got it because if you feel your heart racing and if things are difficult, then this is the disease that you've got, and you know need to take medication or run out or whatever, and not being told that experiencing emotions, and like you were saying, Meredith, having quite maybe sorry. Hey, Viva. Um, having extreme emotions might actually just be part of what it is to be a teenager. And it's only if it's really, really chronic that we might start looking at whether it's related to the way that they think. And for parents to understand that the teens might, I mean, that's one of the things I love of working with teenagers, that they'll be like, oh, wow, a pizza, that's amazing. Look, a puppy. Oh, God, I'm devastated. My favorite band didn't bring out a song that I like, you know, and it's like their emotions will be really up and down, but in a really, I don't know, engaged and joyful way, as well as feeling low emotions. And I think sometimes parents need to understand that these teenagers are going through these waves of change and challenge and hormones, and that we can get too hung up on something like a messy bedroom. When I actually heard a psychiatrist say the other day, do you know the teenagers I'm worried about? The ones with the tidy bedrooms. Because actually it's completely normal and healthy for teenagers to not be that focused on their bedrooms. And yeah, the one last thing I wanted to say was I was thinking about all the teenagers, which it must actually be thousands of teenagers that I've worked with in that time and over those 27 years. And I was thinking, what were the teenagers that I've met that I can really say that were really thriving? And the ones that I met that were really in a state of eudaimonia, or you know, flourishing, and were really living according to virtue, and were really engaged with their communities and really understood about what was in their control and using the Stoic culture and all of that. They were all teens who had significant adversity. Like one of them, I actually heard from her the other day, and I taught her many, many years ago, and she had rheumatoid, how do you say it, rheumatoid arthritis, and had terrible, terrible disability from that. And she's just qualified as a doctor. And she was letting me know that she got through everything. And she was always, you know, so focused on having good character, so focused on what was under her control. And I was telling Brittany right at the very beginning, before we started this, about I was worried about telling this story about a teenager who I worked with who was very disabled with cerebral palsy, and so she could only move her fingers on one hand. She was almost completely blind. She had a very severe speech impediment, and unfortunately, she'd also experienced some really horrible trauma and rejection from family members. And yet she was joyful and she was engaged and she was so focused on, you know, what was in her control and what really mattered. And she was so connected to the community and thinking about, you know, how she could be part of and serve her community. And, you know, she was so clear about what life was about. And I was thinking, actually, I think that's not a coincidence because I think, like, for example, my own journey with Stoicism, I think, has been informed by the fact that I'm going blind. So I've had to like learn to step up in order to still be able to thrive with that adversity. And so I think the teams that have taught me the most have been the ones that have had the biggest things to deal with. And I'm with you, Meredith. I think people should stop giving teens a bad press and think about what we can learn from them as well as what we can teach them.
Thank you, Eve. Thank you for sharing those stories. That's very beautiful and touching. So I think that can add a lot to our discussion today, going back to what Paul introduced, the idea of the tree. Trees that are not buffeted by the wind are very weak, and those that do have to face some challenges and difficulties are often the strongest. And I think those examples just bear that out beautifully. So thank you for that. Let's turn now to some more specific examples of the challenges that teens face. We've already alluded to several of them, but I'd like to return to you, Meredith, with some of the discussion of social media or the different social pressures that our teens are facing today, and maybe some strategies or some ways that you've seen teens effectively deal with these.
Yes. Very briefly, I was just going to say the statistics about teens and their mental health, it's very sobering. So I was just going to mention that, you know, I recently read results of a study by the CDC in the US saying that 3 out of 5 high school girls in the US reported feelings of persistent sadness or hopelessness. And 41% of girls reported poor mental health in the previous 30 days, and 18% of boys did. 20% of girls reported being cyberbullied in the past year, and 11% of boys did. This is really staggering to look at. So, I mean, the problems are real. You know, there has been a noticeable kind of uptick in some of these things in the past decade. And some researchers point to 2012 as kind of a turning point of when things started to seem to go downhill more, and therefore they see some correlation with the rise of smartphones and especially social media on smartphones. I mean, I think there's still some debate among researchers about it, but clearly things are not good. And we need to really talk about this and think about this. And you know, and one thing I've kind of said with my daughters is, you know, what are the 2 most judgmental places in the world for people to be in? And they are high school and social media. It's like, this is, you know, the perfect storm. And when I think about that, I talk to my kids and they tell me about how, you know, they're aware that what they see on social media is just a small sliver of other people's lives that is made to look cool and amazing and enviable and exciting, and it's quite fake. But then they also point out that, you know, when people try to show their kind of real selves on social media or something that's unpolished, they sometimes get a lot of blowback and comments and kind of bullying or whatever. So it's really dicey. On the other hand, they can't completely eliminate social media or even, you know, just being online in these ways from their lives, because it's a way that they keep up with their friends and their peers and their clubs and their schools. And even me, I have to use Instagram to actually literally find out what's happening at my kids' large public high school, because I don't get the information in any other way as quickly and as easily or even as fully about, you know, what's happening. And so we can't necessarily just say, okay, let's just get off social media. Let's just get off the web. Let's just, you know, become Luddites. I mean, there's been some press stories about Luddite clubs among teens who want to completely ditch their smartphones and ditch the internet. But I think it's not realistic, because that can isolate you at this point. I mean, this is how things are happening. This is how things are being shared. So one thing I try to do is explain to my kids that social media companies are designed to make money by getting you to stay on the app as long as possible. And in that sense, they're exploiting you for their monetary gain. So if you're aware of that, at least you know that, you know, they are actively using neuroscience to actually get you more addicted. And I think those are the kinds of things I've tried to raise awareness with. And you know, my kids are interested in science and things like that, so they kind of see that now and they get that. I think you have to start thinking about how you're going to set limits around things when kids are actually quite young, to start building this muscle about setting the limits with them and for them, and helping them make good choices when they're quite young, so that then they can start to be able to do that a little bit more for themselves. So for example, time limits on, you know, an iPad, a laptop, a smartphone within apps and things, I think are a good place to begin to, and kind of explain it to the kids, like when they're younger. I'm really talking about maybe when they're, you know, if they're using these devices when they're 10 or 11 or 12, and then kind of getting them to see there's a reason why you want to limit yourself, and trying to help them learn how to actually build that into their own life. I literally, one of my kids actually asked me to reset some limits on her apps because she said, you know, this actually helps, or she set her own limits. So I think it's really hard because you as I said, you can't really live without it, but the addiction is real. The addiction to social media is very common among kids that might, you know, and that we know. I mean, addiction is hard. Maybe I shouldn't define it as addiction, but it's just, you know, the constant need, the idea they can't live without it. I will also mention very briefly in passing, online porn is a real issue, and it's something to be aware of, that kids find it very appealing, and some kids will feel somewhat addicted to it. And with COVID making all our lives go completely online for a period of time, all of these things were exacerbated. So I feel that, you know, the antidotes are trying to train your kids to set boundaries around it, to understand what it is and the purposes for using it, and the purposes that can serve your own choices, your own decisions, not those of a social media platform or company, not those of advertisers who want you to be there. And also the second thing is time in person with friends, time in person with family, really trying to build that in and build in a way to make sure that you're interacting socially. Because Stoicism teaches us that we are all pro-social beings. In addition to our kind of power of choice and rationality, the biggest thing is that we are made to work with each other. We are made to live with each other and to support each other. It's part of our nature. And I think that's really important. So I work with my kids and other kids, like through Girl Scouts and so on, to try to get them to come together and actually talk to each other and see each other in real life.
Yeah, that's so important to have something meaningful to replace the online world with, to make sure that they have those connections that are worth pursuing in everyday life. And I can say as well, speaking from my experience with approaching tweens now, my oldest daughter is 10, we definitely set limits at our house on screen usage. And there's a ubiquitous question that I hear every day: when can I get a phone? And Stoicism has helped me by not bending to the perceived pressure of what everybody else is doing, which, you know, that's the classic line, well, all my friends have a phone, all my friends are doing this, right? And I just am very clear with my kids that that's not how we make our decisions. We don't make our decisions based on what everybody else is doing, but on what we think is right. And then I share my principles, my reasons for allowing or not allowing things. And as my kids get older, I try to bring them into the conversation more. You know, maybe we can think of the pros and cons, but just in general, making sure they understand that my husband and I do have reasons for all the limits we set. It's not just arbitrary, it's not just authoritarianism, but there are actually reasons, just like you shared, Meredith, for why we do these things and make these decisions. So thank you very much for bringing that into the conversation. So I'd like to now open it up to all three of you, Paul and Eve as well. We have talked about some of the challenges that teens face with our society, kind of the shrinking friendship networks that they might have, or the fraying social fabric. Paul, I know you've talked about this before as a challenge that everyone faces. And of course, teens feel this in a more extreme way since they don't have that rootedness to begin with a lot of times. Eve, we've talked about some of the doom mongering that happens in the news media about the challenges that the world faces and how this can really put pressure on teens. So I'd just like to open it up to all three of you now. what are some of these challenges? How do you see Stoicism addressing some of these very pressing challenges that our teens are facing?
I could tell you something that's a bit shaming about myself because it's my failure of temperance. Because I was very news addicted, and I was constantly reading the news, watching the news, all of that. And every year I would be like, I should have more self-control. I'm going to be able. This is not wise, and all of that. And I agree with you, Meredith and Paul, that I think this is a massive reason. Like people say teenagers are depressed and anxious as if it is situated within the teenager and as if they're not living with what looks like Armageddon, and this terrible dystopian future that they're thinking is coming their way. No wonder they're depressed. This year, I gave up with trying to get myself to stop watching so much news, and I stopped watching all news. And I I came off a lot of social media. I stopped watching all news, and I've been sharing my journey with that with my daughter, who also struggles with all the negativity that's out there. And I think sometimes you need to take action in that kind of a way when what you're doing isn't working. And when you think about it, the news that is given to us, it isn't all of the news, is it? It's what will get us to watch. It's what will mean that we see adverts. And so it feels like quite a rebellious act, quite a joyful, hopeful act to say. I know it's a bit extreme, but to say I'm not going to watch the news anymore. I'm going to find out about the world through other means, and I'm going to continue to be very engaged with the world, but it's not going to be through traditional news media or social media. And in terms of social media, I haven't left it completely, but I've been trying to follow Marcus Aurelius in book 1 of Meditations, where he's kind of saying, who can you be inspired by? Isn't he? He's saying, like, who is a good role model? And if you very carefully curate social media, then potentially you're just getting all this inspiration of role models who are showing you really, ways to live well. So yeah, that's what I've been doing. And then I've shared that with my daughter, and I think it does feel quite almost naughty to say that I'm not reading the news anymore. But I don't care. I definitely feel better. And so I think maybe it's about teens realizing that there can be a rebellion in deciding to unfollow somebody or mute them, or not feel that you've got to be up to date with every latest development in wars or whatever is going on in the world.
I love it. Harnessing the power of teenage rebellion for a good cause. Okay, thank you, Eve. Paul or Meredith, any other thoughts on some of those larger issues?
I can add a couple of things, I suppose. It's very interested in all of the issues that were just raised. I think it's so difficult. I mean, I make a personal choice never to use social media. That's my choice as an individual. I know that disadvantages me in some ways, but I'm happy to pay that price to be out of that world. I know that lots of other people, many other people, make different choices, and I respect their right to do that. But I think it really is, the world of social media is a very hostile environment for young people in particular, who do not have the psychological armor to cope with the onslaught of the experience there. So what is really useful, I think, from Stoicism is the idea of the inner citadel, of training the mind to be able to cope with the social context, with the steady bombardment of ideas, of images, of sensations that come through social media. And I find a nice description of what the inner citadel means in a work by Elizabethan poet John Donne. You may be familiar with his work, No Man is an Island, and so forth. Very stoic in many ways, his perceptions. And I know he read Stoicism as a young man, but his description of the inner citadel was along these lines: "Be thine own palace, or let the world be thy jail." And I think that was written 400 years before the advent of social media, but it's totally relevant in that space. So we have to train our young people, I think, to occupy that space and protect themselves against all they will experience there through concepts like the inner citadel, making your mind a fortress, making it the most peaceful, placid, protected place. And then maybe you're ready to step into that arena. Until then, you're probably not. I have a more specific concern, I suppose, about young men. We've referenced the proliferation of pornography via social media, and of course that's true. And young men in particular are probably more susceptible to its presence in the way they can become extraordinarily unhealthy. But there are other reasons of being concerned about young men, I feel, because I deliver a lot of online content relating to self-care, well-being, with a preventative focus. I am always struck by the fact that there is an overrepresentation of women and an underrepresentation of men. So it usually works out to be something like a 75-25% split with alarming consistency. Why is that alarming? Because men are overrepresented in other areas, and the main area they are overrepresented is in suicide statistics, where they are 3 times more likely to commit suicide than women are. So there's clearly a direct correlation between those two things. So if it's difficult to lure young men in general, into the self-care space, what works? Well, strangely, Stoicism does, because it offers an inspiring and positive and healthy form of masculinity in a really important space. Because other than that, what is left to young men who may not have strong parental role models, particularly male parental role models, and may go online and encounter individuals who encourage them instead to focus upon things such as muscles and money and, well, frankly, misogyny. That's really unhealthy role modeling, and young men are very vulnerable towards it. It's psychologically corrosive. It will not do them any good in their later life. It's effectively poison. Stoicism offers the antidote to that poison with a healthy, powerful, effective form of masculinity through inspiring people like Epictetus the slave, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, both of whom, though very privileged in many ways, suffered from ill health most of their lives and had many obstacles to overcome. So they are good images of masculinity and resilience and well-being. I would offer Stoicism as an antidote to all of that negative and dark psychology that currently proliferates on social media. That kind of cartoonish version of masculinity that we see, which is sometimes it's described as toxic. I can certainly understand that. I would describe it as cartoonish. It's not real masculinity. That's a much harder status than the type of masculinity we see so frequently portrayed on social media. I may have gone off at a slight tangent there. Forgive me for that. But my primary concern, I suppose, not exclusive concern, because I focus on different aspects of female health too, is that. And the damage that is doing to young men across the world every day.
No, thank you for that. That's perfect. A very apt observation, especially since we are in a Stoic space here. I'd just like to turn now in our remaining time to talking about self-care for parents. So up to now, we've been focusing on how we can help guide our teens and young adults. How do we as parents help weather that storm and, retain our own emotional stability and put ourselves in a position where we can help guide our children? So all of you have worked on self-care in this space. Eve, do you have any thoughts, having dealt with a lot of different families who are working on this?
Yeah, I see a lot of parents, particularly mothers, because that sometimes, as Paul was saying, the dad isn't there, but also it just seems a lot of the parenting is still falling on mothers, whether they're working or not. And I think I agree with you, Paul, that that's not good, because we need we need the fathers there as well to be doing the parenting too. But I see a lot of mothers particularly that are so depleted and that are trying to sacrifice themselves, sometimes completely, every aspect of themselves, their mental health, their physical health, their career, their body, in order to protect and care for their children. And what I have to say to them is that you can't do that. It does not work. And it doesn't matter if you utterly destroyed yourself. You still would not protect your child from self-harming. You still would not be able to make your mentally unwell teen any better, because I always come back to this moment that I had when my daughter was very little and I was eating a Chinese takeaway, and I opened the fortune cookie, and inside it, it said the only way to get your child to walk down the right path in life is to walk that path yourself. And I was like, damn it, really? Can I not just say this is what you should do? And yeah, so annoyingly correct fortune cookie. I don't know if they all contain such wisdom. Maybe try eating some later and see what comes out, because that was quite life-changing. But you know, I think it's something Epictetus said. I'm never very good at doing quotes, but he basically said, how are your like thoughts and words and actions affecting others? If you're, you know, if you're a woman raising girls, as some of us are here, and raising young women, what are we showing our young women if we sacrifice ourselves, if we neglect our self-care, if we have unboundaried relationships, if we allow our children to disrespect us, if we disrespect ourselves and our bodies and our needs? We are not doing the thing, you know, going back to what Marcus Aurelius talked about, you know, in book 1, we are not being that role model. We are not showing what we do in a very good light. And it actually doesn't matter if we mess up. And in fact, when we mess up, that's ideal, I think. So, you know, when we mess up, like with our self-care or something, we can say to our teams, oh, I've been feeling, you know, really burnt out because I wasn't really being very self-controlled about the way that I was handling work. I wasn't being very boundaried, or I was trying to control the outcomes when I was working with a client and I was feeling really stressed. And now I realize that I need to focus on, you know, did I do everything that I could do? I'm not, you know, so kind of like spelling out our journey with our own self-care is going to have a much bigger impact than trying to give our children everything that they think they want. And I think we need to have the courage to put those boundaries in place. And it's really difficult because I think we are living in an era of helicopter parenting. I think we are living in an era where, particularly, well, it seems to me in my lived experience, mothers seem to be being blamed for their teenagers' mental health or held responsible for that. It's you have to be rebellious to say, no, you I'm not going to constantly be driving you around to things. I need to go to the gym, or I need to work. I can't take you to that thing. So yeah, so I think it's all about put your own oxygen mask on there, as difficult as that is. And I'm not saying it's easy. I think it takes a tremendous amount of courage. I'm not saying I always get that right. It's something I continually try to work on.
I love that, Eve. Thank you so much. And I think it's interesting for me, being a parent of still young children, seeing how with an older child, with a teen, you can actually bring them on your journey with you. Whereas you couldn't really do that with a 6-year-old, but with an older teen, you know, you can verbalize your thought process. And it made me think about the Stoic view on rationality. The ancient Stoics believed that, you know, children are not really morally responsible for their actions, but once you become an adult, around the age of 14 is when they thought the rationality started to develop. Although, of course, it's not finalized then, as we know, but that's when they can kind of grasp the adult-like concepts of morality and philosophy. And so bringing them on that journey with you and really talking through what you're going through, that seems really beautiful to me. So thank you for sharing that. We are a little bit short on time. We've got about maybe 5 more minutes. Meredith, do you have anything you'd like to add to that, or maybe some final thoughts?
Sure, and I'll try to keep this brief. I'm always inspired by Seneca's words around the topic of we are all patients in the same hospital. I want to share that with all parents, because I think we need to realize we're in this journey together, and it's hard, and there's no expert coming to save us. So we have to kind of save ourselves and save each other. And that's really echoing what Eve just said, which I think was a beautiful sentiment as well. The teen years also come at a hard time for parents. There are hormonal changes happening. There are career pressures. There are financial pressures. Let's make sure that we work and help ourselves, work on ourselves, but also help ourselves first. And a lot of that is about questioning the impression of what matters with our kids. Maybe not giving in, as you said, Eve, like fighting against kind of this idea that somehow we have to be helicopter parents that are constantly bulldozing all the obstacles for our children. And we can get mutual support from each other. We can talk to other parents and make friends with them, or if they're too competitive or anxious to be around, find people outside that network and find new people who can be supportive of us and have compassion for what we're going through. We can keep in mind our kids are individuals. They're humans. It's our role to develop them as human beings and not to control them and turn them into some product that we wanted them to become. And therefore, don't base our self-worth in how our kids turn out or how our kids behave. We are just doing the best we can in this moment that we're in, and we're all humans. Mistakes will happen, and kind of kids can learn from the mistakes, so can parents. So I think, and I just want to say one plug for sleep. I think one problem with our teens is they have trouble getting enough sleep, and they're very distracted by everything in their lives, and they're very, very busy people too. So I think if we could help kids with one thing, it would probably be helping them to try to get better sleep so that they can actually think through these things a little bit more rationally and use the Stoic side of their mindset better.
And make sure the parents get enough sleep too.
And make sure the parents get enough sleep too. While we're at it, we should not be staying up and ensuring our kids are sleeping. We need to sleep too, and we need to take care of our own health and our own mental health, because and that's part of what I mean about, not basing ourselves and our self-worth in our kids, because that's where a lot of these anxieties I think come from, is like, oh, I didn't do this for my child, or I wasn't able to protect my child from that. It's a really hard lesson to realize we can't protect our children from everything, but we can be still wonderful parents, and we can be there for ourselves in addition to being there for our children.